Really? Okay. So you were talking about these stepped
That's right.
semiconductors?
So the most advanced semiconductors right now are multi-junction cells, and that's one of the directions that we are moving towards. And so instead of just having a single crystal like silicon or gallium arsenide, we step the band gap in regular intervals. These are very complex structures because you have to do things like current matching, and they're like connecting solar cells in series. It's almost like you have many different solar cells that are connected in series. And by doing that, you now can capture a lot more of the spectrum, and you can capture a very specific set of photons in very specific materials. So it solves a lot of the problems, and it allows you to push the efficiency of these solar cells up to much higher levels. These are commercial, and almost everything that goes out in space has multi-junction technology on it. And in fact, Albuquerque plays a big role in it because MCOR is one of the largest suppliers of multi-junction solar cells in the world. So practically any satellite or the space station, anything that's out in space has multi-junction because for two reasons really. One is that you get more efficiency, and the second is that 3-5 materials are way more radiation hardened than silicon, which means that you can expose them to gamma radiation in space and other forms of high energy radiation, and yet get a longer lifetime out of it compared to silicon. So that's the two reasons why you do send these things out there.
I'm sorry, so what's the relationship between a 3-5 semiconductor and a multi-junction one? Are multi-junctions semiconductors only possible with 3-5?
Again, that's an excellent question, and yes, and the reason, and yes to a certain extent. So let me explain myself. If you have a silicon solar cell and you decide, so you're stuck with one material, one band gap. Now there's a second part to this conversation, which is your lattice constant. The lattice constant is the spacing between the atoms. Now if you want to grow through two semiconductors epitaxially, one of the rules that we follow is that things should be lattice matched. If they're not lattice matched, it's kind of like taking two Lego blocks with different sizes and mashing it together. It's going to split one of the blocks because there's too much strain in the material. And likewise, if you grow a mismatched semiconductor on a substrate, it's going to dislocate and form lots of defects, which makes it useless for device usage. It so happens that if you do solar cells and multi-junction solar cells with elemental semiconductors, you could do silicon and germanium and then use steps that have different ratios of silicon and germanium in them as different levels. The problem though is that you start with silicon, which is already well into the infrared, and you're moving further into the infrared. Okay. Now at 3-5s, while staying lattice matched to gallium arsenide or germanium, you can produce a lot of different band gaps without walking off the lattice constant. And you do this by mixing, say for instance, you can use aluminum arsenide, which is close to green in wavelength, and you can mix it with gallium arsenide, which is a little bit in the infrared. And by mixing these two, you can get different band gaps. So if I have 50-50, I get a certain band gap. 75-25 gives me a different band gap. So 3-5s allow you to tailor the band gap quite a bit, which you can't do with silicon, or you can't do with single junction. If you just buy a boule of gallium arsenide or silicon, you can't do that. And that's what makes the combination of epitaxy and 3-5 semiconductors rather critical to the multi-junction solar cells, because you can change the ratios and grow materials with different compositions and different band gaps.
Cool. And so I'm just curious, why don't we do a tighter shot, because it'll be something different. I'm just curious how long those multi-junctions have been around. How old are they? Do you know?
Yeah, so multi-junctions have been around for a long time. I think that NREL played an important role, Colorado played an important role in the development. MCOR's been around doing it for several years. And if you notice, there's a very famous chart that NREL publishes, and NREL stands for National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And they chart a variety of renewable energy technologies, photovoltaics, and they plot it as a function, time versus efficiency. So you can see the efficiency creep up over time as you do more and more band engineering, more and more epitaxial engineering. You're able to push these technologies further and further in efficiency. So this is probably the chart traces the advent of multi-junction cells from I think 80s all the way to the present day. And right now triple junctions are considered very mature technologies. These are 3 materials, and like I said, that would be InGaP, gallium arsenide, germanium. But I do know that people are now moving towards 5-6 junctions, and what is happening then is you run out of lattice match material. So the latest in solar cell technology is called your inverted metamorphic solar cells. And the way these are grown is you grow them upside down on a gallium arsenide wafer, going from the widest band gap grown very close to the substrate and the narrowest gap grown very far away from the substrate. The narrow gaps are typically grown dislocated because they're metamorphic, or you've grown something with a different lattice constant on the substrate, so they are dislocated. But what happens is that you take these solar cells, for instance, if this were your cell, you glue it to a handle like glass, you flip it over, and you etch off the substrate. So now it's inverted, and hence the name inverted. It also has metamorphic layers, hence the name inverted metamorphic. And it has multiple junctions, so it's called inverted metamorphic multi-junction solar cells. And what you do is the topmost layers, about I would say 80% of your spectrum is absorbed in pristine defect-free lattice match semiconductor. The last 20% is absorbed in the metamorphic material, and it's found that it doesn't cause too much degradation to the efficiency of the solar cell, and you can get away with it. You also have significant cost benefits because the triple junction solar cell is grown on germanium wafers, which are expensive and are big. Whereas inverted metamorphic solar cells don't have the substrate. It also helps because if you're putting this out in space, then the payload, the weight goes down considerably, which makes it also a beneficial technology. So I think 6-junction IMMs, or inverted metamorphic multi-junction solar cells, are what's being researched right now.
So is this what gave you the idea for combining the photovoltaics and the thermal voltaics and the RFs, like that idea that you've got this multi-junction solar voltaic thing happening?
Yes and no. The distinction between solar and thermal is like this. If you look at solar, it's a very unique form of energy, and it's clearly the basis for all life on Earth. But it has some unique characteristics. It's not uniform during the day. It fluctuates based on cloud cover. It's a little less intense in the morning compared to the afternoon, and then it fades away, and in the night you have nothing at all. And it's a natural source of energy. It comes from the sun, and it follows whatever the sun does. Thermophotovoltaics are sort of a distant cousin in the sense that they also use similar black body photons, but these are typically man-made sources of photons. These are energy sources of energy that you might otherwise not tap or just radiate away and waste. So thermophotovoltaics were initially used in deep space probes like the Voyager, where you'd have a little nuclear reactor, and since you can't have a turbine there, where as the nuclear reaction proceeds, you heat water gets converted to steam runs a turbine, and in that form factor, when you're sending stuff into space, you can't have moving parts. What you do is you heat something up with the radiation, with the nuclear reactor, and that thermal energy is converted to power using TPVs. So you must keep in mind that the cooler something is, the further it is in the infrared. So the human body radiates photons as well, but it does so at 8-9 microns or even longer. A hot kettle might radiate somewhere at 3 microns or 4 microns. A propane flame in the range of, if it's direct, it's very hot, but an indirectly heated, some other object that's heated by a propane flame could perhaps be at 2.4 microns. And if you get to something as hot as the sun, then it's 500 nanometers and shorter. So you can see that the hotter something gets, the closer it gets to ultraviolet, and the cooler something is, the closer it is to infrared. The problem there, though, is that when you build something to harness thermal energy that's not from the sun, then you have to know where the spectrum is. So for instance, if you're designing something to use energy off of a car's exhaust or an engine, you probably might want to target 4 micron absorbers and grow stuff that's in 4 microns. Then you do that with antimonide semiconductors. For instance, the propane flame based technologies can span 1.5 to 2.4 microns. I've seen examples of them in that range, where people have a furnace to heat their homes in the winter, and then they can also use the excess energy to then maybe power a light bulb or so. Cool. So it's more of a, unless it's a nuclear reactor or a propane driven system, I think that TPVs would then find a niche in absorbing energy that's being wasted. Another very interesting example is we have these massive heat sinks on our microprocessors these days, because these things run at a very high temperature. Again, that's another way to perhaps put an intermediate material like sapphire or CVD diamond to spread the heat and make a radiator out of that, which is then coupled to a thermophotovoltaic device, and one could harvest feedback energy. These are all very small amounts of energy, but in the long run, if you develop harvesting technology, you'll be surprised by how much energy you can recover instead of just wasting it. So it all counts.
I wanted to ask you about the scale. So just so people can get an idea, what is the difference in scale between the energy, thermal or otherwise, that